Cherbourg, spring of 1945. The rain had just stopped, leaving streaks of mud across the concrete of the captured Luftwaffe installation. The air smelled of wet metal and diesel. A group of German engineers, still in their faded gray uniforms, were escorted through the ruined hangars by American soldiers. They expected to see artillery, perhaps the remains of aircraft engines, but what awaited them was something else entirely. A silent steel arm turning against the pale French sky. It wasn't a gun. It moved too smoothly for that. The antenna, perched on a motorized base, swept in wide arcs, its rhythmic hum cutting through the fog like a pulse. One of the men, Lieutenant Klaus Weber of the former Luftnachrichten Regiment, stopped mid-step. "Das ist unmöglich," he whispered. "It sees through the clouds. Like a god." The Americans called it the SCR-270. To the Germans, it looked like witchcraft. The machine stood 12 feet tall, its rectangular grid shimmering with dew. When it turned, it seemed to scan the heavens themselves. Inside the nearby operations hut, the green glow of a cathode ray tube flickered. Each sweep drew a bright line across the screen, then tiny echoes appeared, moving dots alive, recording invisible aircraft miles away. An American technician adjusted a dial and smiled faintly, almost casually. "We can see 40, sometimes 50 miles when the air is good," he said, without looking up. The Germans stared, realizing this was no mere experiment. It was a system, one of thousands built by the United States and deployed across every coast, every airfield, every convoy route. Outside, the wind rattled the tarpaulins covering crates stamped Signal Corps, U.S. Army. The crates contained magnetrons, transformers, and spare oscillators, parts of a vast technological web. One German engineer, Dr. Otto Reinhardt, tried to imagine the logistics behind it, the foundries, the copper wiring, the workforce. His country had fought to keep radar a secret. America had turned it into an industry. For a long time, no one spoke. The rhythmic sweep of the antenna filled the silence. Then, faintly, from somewhere near the docks came the distant sound of an engine starting, the same kind of sound that radar operators had tracked for years, long before eyes could see what ears could not. A storm of thoughts crossed Weber's mind. They had spent the war believing that mastery of the air came from speed, altitude, and firepower. But here, before his eyes, stood proof that victory came from sight, from knowing. The radar turned again, slow, deliberate, patient, as if scanning not for enemies, but for truth itself. And in that moment, he felt smaller than he ever had in the war, not because of defeat, but because he finally understood the scale of what he had been blind to. In war, nothing is more terrifying than the enemy who can see you before you even know you've been seen. If you value stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps preserve forgotten chapters of history. Share your location and local time in the comments below. History connects us across every horizon. The Americans called it the eye in the sky. Yet to the German engineers who examined its workings that spring, it felt more like an oracle, one that whispered the secrets of the air. They were told its name, SCR-270. The long-range radar first tested in 1939 and capable of detecting aircraft up to 150 miles away. Its cousin, the SCR-584, could track a single moving target within 0.2 degrees of accuracy, guiding anti-aircraft guns as if the shells themselves could see. The Americans spoke about it plainly, almost casually, as though describing plumbing or radio towers. But the Germans understood the deeper implication. This was not just machinery. It was vision turned into power. Since 1936, while Europe was bracing for war, U.S. laboratories from New Jersey to Massachusetts had been experimenting with invisible waves. In 1941, before Pearl Harbor, nearly 2,000 radar sets had already been produced by American factories. They learned to tame the magnetron, to shape microwaves into narrow beams, and to read the echoes like language. One echo meant a plane. Two meant a formation, a faint pulse pulse might mean a bomber at altitude, masked by cloud. The irony hung thick in the air. One of the very first Japanese formations attacking Pearl Harbor had been detected by an SCR-270 on Oahu's northern coast. A young operator named Joseph Lockhart saw the massive blip at 7:02 a.m., but his warning was dismissed. "Probably a training flight," his superior said. The machine had seen the future. Men had refused to believe it. Dr. Reinhardt recalled how, early in the war, Germany had captured several British radar stations near Calais and Boulogne. The German command had dismissed them as crude, early warning devices. They never imagined that the Americans would take the same idea and build an interlocking grid stretching from Newfoundland to the Pacific. A global map of vigilance, powered not by soldiers, but by electrons. On a blackboard inside the hangar, an American officer sketched a map of how these stations communicated. Each antenna covered its neighbor, forming a continuous chain. "You can't sneak through darkness anymore," he said, half smiling. The Germans looked at one another. Men who had spent their lives calculating trajectories and resonance frequencies, now realizing that their enemy had transcended the laboratory. They were seeing the architecture of omniscience. Lieutenant Weber's hand trembled as he reached for a piece of chalk left on the table. He drew a question mark beside the antenna diagram, then slowly erased it. There was no question left to ask. For all the bombs, tanks, and rockets they had built, they had been blind artisans of destruction. The Americans had built something else entirely, a window into the invisible. The hum of the radar continued outside, scanning endlessly, its mechanical heartbeat echoing across the bay. The sound of a new kind of warfare, where knowledge replaced noise and sight replaced superstition. Before radar, the night sky was a void, a black sea where pilots flew by instinct and faith, guided only by stars that clouds could easily swallow. The war had been fought in blindness. Anti-aircraft crews fired at sound and shadow. Whole cities lived or died, depending on the accuracy of searchlights. Then came the green glow of the cathode ray tube, and with it, the end of darkness. In the operations hut near Cherbourg, Klaus Weber and the other engineers stood before one such screen. Across its circular face, a bright line swept round and round, each rotation like the ticking of a divine clock. Every time it passed, small echoes appeared. Aircraft, ships, sometimes flocks of birds mistaken for machines. It was mesmerizing. The operator pointed to one moving dot. "That's a B-17 returning from Hamburg," he said. "They're 50 miles out, and we already know their speed." The data was staggering. By 1944, the United States and Britain together maintained over 100,000 radar stations of various types, from long-range coastal units to small mobile sets mounted on trucks and ships. Germany, despite its early innovation with Freya and Würzburg radars, fielded fewer than 10,000, many limited in range, accuracy, or mobility. A British liaison officer explained how radar had turned every metal object in the sky into a visible signature. "We no longer fight blind," he said. "We fight with foresight." For Weber, it was an intellectual humiliation deeper than defeat. He thought of the years spent perfecting ballistics, the endless obsession with bigger guns and faster aircraft. Yet none of that mattered if one side could see everything. A machine like this didn't need heroism. It needed patience, calibration, discipline. Virtues Germany had once claimed as its own. He remembered one winter night in 1943 when Berlin's sirens howled as RAF bombers arrived unseen through the clouds. Their own radar network, crippled by shortages, could not even track them properly. Now, watching the glowing screen, he realized that what had seemed supernatural back then was simply the result of a working system, an eye that never blinked. A nearby American technician, young enough to be Weber's son, leaned on the table. "We call her Gloria," he said, patting the console affectionately. "She's never wrong." The casual tone stung. The Germans had built machines to serve ideology. The Americans built them to serve information. Dr. Reinhardt whispered, half to himself, "We built the gun. They built the eye. The radar sweep continued its eternal rotation. Each flicker was a plane, a life, a decision. The engineers stood transfixed as if before an altar. Outside, dawn began to break over the sea, gray, cold, infinite. But inside that hut, they had seen the true dawn, the birth of total awareness. Across the Atlantic, thousands of miles from the mud and ruins of Cherbourg, the beating heart of radar innovation pulsed inside a cluster of brick buildings at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. The sign read Radiation Laboratory, but to those who worked within, it was known simply as the Rad Lab. It was here that the invisible frontier of the war was fought not with bullets, but with equations. Inside, day and night blurred. More than 4,000 scientists, engineers, and draftsmen, many in rolled-up sleeves, some still wearing college rings, worked in shifts that never ended. Oscilloscopes glowed through the night, blueprints covered the floors, coffee cups outnumbered test tubes. The scientists called themselves the people who lit the night. Their task was monumental: to perfect the magnetron, to build radars small enough for aircraft, strong enough for ships, and precise enough to detect a single enemy bomber through rain and cloud. One young physicist, Harold Mendel, wrote in his notebook, "We measure what cannot be seen. We turn silence into sound, emptiness into form." Around him, colleagues calibrated cathode tubes, shaped copper waveguides, and tested reflection patterns inside makeshift echo chambers. Outside, the Charles River shimmered under searchlights from the Navy base. The contrast of science and war never sharper. Their work had already transformed the battlefield. In June 1944, when the fog rolled thick over the English Channel, radar-equipped landing craft and aircraft guided the D-Day invasion through what should have been blinding weather. SCR 584 units aboard ships adjusted artillery trajectories from 10 miles offshore. Air controllers in the sky used radar to separate bombers flying in formation at night, saving countless lives that would otherwise have collided in the dark. Each success at the Rad Lab carried a quiet irony. Men and women creating instruments of survival, even as others used them to destroy. A janitor once said the hum of the radar transmitters reminded him of a church organ playing without mercy. Back in Cherbourg, the German engineers were shown a recorded demonstration from this very laboratory. A film reel depicting bright dots moving across a radar scope as an instructor's voice explained the readings. When the lights came up, the room was silent. Weber sat motionless, remembering his own laboratory at Jena, the shortages, the bombing, the silence of projects that never reached completion. On the wall, an American technician had written in chalk, "The night has no secrets anymore." Weber stared at it, feeling something shift inside him. Not fear, but respect. This was what war had become. Not the roar of engines, but the whisper of electrons. He looked again at the glowing radar screen and thought of the words he had spoken days before. It sees through clouds like a god. Now he knew that God had been built not in temples, but in laboratories filled with sleepless men and women who believed that light, even artificial light, could save the world. By early summer 1945, the war in Europe was nearly over. The guns had fallen silent, yet curiosity had not. At an Allied testing site in Reims, France, a temporary laboratory had been established inside a commandeered university building. Its rooms were filled with captured German electronics and American radar systems placed side by side, as if to let them silently argue. Klaus Weber, still in his gray engineer's jacket, was brought there under escort. Across the hall, an American technical officer named Captain Richard Hall, formerly of the Bell Telephone Laboratories, was calibrating the parabolic dish of an SCR 584 radar that had been hastily assembled for demonstration. The parabolic dish gleamed in the sunlight, every curve precise, as if carved for worship rather than war. Weber approached it slowly. His fingertips brushed the cold metal. "You use this to guide rockets?" he asked in careful English. Hall smiled faintly, not pausing his work. "No," he said. "We use it to find our way home." The words landed like a quiet explosion. To Weber, radar had always meant attack or defense, the detection of targets, the orchestration of destruction. But here was a man speaking of return, of safety, of navigation. For Hall, the same mathematics that aimed guns also guided pilots through storms. The same radio waves that found enemies also saved allies. Hall adjusted a dial, and the scope lit up with a pulse. "You see," he said, "the radar doesn't care who's flying. It only reads the sky." Reinhardt stood nearby, watching the beam trace arcs across the screen. He thought of his family somewhere in Munich, the air raids, the endless alarms. How many of those bombers had been guided by invisible hands like these? Yet he couldn't help admiring the precision, the beauty of it, the perfection of logic unhindered by ideology. The two men, American and German, spent hours exchanging fragments of thought. Hall explained that the magnetron used in this set was based on a British invention, refined by MIT engineers, mass-produced in factories employing women, welders, and college students. Weber nodded silently, realizing that radar had not been born in secret bunkers, but in collaboration. Thousands of minds connected by one purpose: to see what was hidden. Outside, the parabolic dish turned slowly, scanning the empty sky of a peaceful afternoon. The wind carried faint laughter from nearby American soldiers cleaning their vehicles, a mundane sound after years of chaos. Weber watched the rotating antenna, the steady hum of the motor like a heartbeat, and felt something close to peace. He finally murmured, "In Germany, we built to destroy. Here, you build to understand." Hall didn't reply. He simply switched off the power, and the radar's green light faded to black, like the closing of an eye that had seen too much. For those watching today, what do you think matters more in the end? The weapon that strikes, or the machine that sees? Share your thoughts below. Your perspective is part of this history. Weeks passed. The German engineers were no longer prisoners so much as students of their conquerors. The Americans seemed almost eager to teach, to show how their system of war was less about domination and more about connection. At a converted airbase near Bournemouth, the visiting engineers were introduced to something that left them speechless once more. A full network of radar-linked command stations, each communicating through microwave relay towers. To Klaus Weber, it felt like stepping into the nervous system of a living organism. One screen tracked bomber squadrons crossing the channel. Another displayed weather fronts in real time. Technicians spoke calmly through headsets, relaying numbers and coordinates that linked airfields hundreds of miles apart. The airwaves themselves had become corridors of control. The Americans called it command and control, a phrase that sounded almost poetic in its simplicity. Through these radar links, data from one site was transmitted instantly to others, allowing aircraft to adjust formation and altitude with precision. To Weber, this was a revelation. Germany had focused on raw firepower, rockets, cannons, jets. Yet here was proof that the war's real weapon was information. One officer explained that the chain-home radar network, built in Britain before 1940, had now evolved into a seamless Allied grid stretching across Europe. The addition of microwave radar links allowed near-instant communication between stations, ships, and aircraft, what the Americans proudly called the first true information web. Dr. Reinhardt was allowed to study some of the circuit diagrams. He was astonished to find that the amplifiers and transmitters used frequency bands higher than anything German scientists had managed to stabilize during the war. "They rid the sky," he muttered, "not just look at it." That night, in his diary, he wrote, "They win not with speed or noise, but with sight. They do not react. They anticipate. It is as if they have already seen tomorrow." The next morning, over breakfast, Weber overheard two American technicians debating whether radar might someday help guide passenger aircraft across the Atlantic. One laughed, saying, "Maybe one day we'll have screens that show everything, everywhere, even weather." To the German engineers, this sounded like fantasy. Yet somewhere inside, they sensed that the future was already forming, born from the static of wartime necessity. As they prepared to leave the control center, Weber glanced once more at the rotating scope. Each green sweep traced an invisible order to the chaos of the sky, a geometry of discipline, of foresight. For the first time, he no longer felt resentment toward the technology that had defeated him. He felt gratitude that such a thing existed, proof that humanity could rise above blindness. For you watching now, when does technology stop being a weapon and become wisdom? Could the same eyes that guide bombs one day guide peace? Share your thoughts. Your answer might be closer to theirs than you think. April 1945. Across Europe, the guns were falling silent. Berlin was collapsing, and the Luftwaffe's final flights were scattered fragments of a dying storm. In England, under a low gray sky near Dover, the German engineers stood inside an Allied radar command post, the last stop in their strange journey through the invisible empire that had conquered them. Before them, an enormous plotting screen glowed with thousands of tiny signals. These weren't bombers or enemy squadrons anymore. They were surrendering aircraft, retreating convoys, refugee ships heading toward ports now guarded by the same antennas that once hunted them. The war's final map was drawn not with lines of battle, but with the hum of frequencies. Klaus Weber pressed his hand against the glass. He watched one small dot moving towards northern Germany. It was identified as a Ju-52, an old transport plane, unarmed, carrying wounded soldiers home. The radar operator marked it with a soft pencil circle. "We'll guide them safely past our patrols," the man said. "No one will fire." That sentence struck Weber harder than any defeat. For years, radar had been the unseen eye of destruction. Now, it was being used to guide mercy. The same wave that once revealed targets was now tracing paths of surrender. Technology had found its soul. At another console, Dr. Reinhardt sat quietly, staring at the glowing scope. Around him, British and American technicians spoke in calm voices, their work stripped of hatred. In the rhythm, he sensed something transcendent, a harmony of mathematics and compassion. He opened his notebook and wrote his final observation. They mapped the sky, and in doing so, they mapped us. Outside, dawn crept over the channel. The radar tower turned lazily, its motor humming against the wind. Birds flew through its beam, unaware that invisible waves were wrapping around their wings. The engineers watched in silence. For them, the antenna had become more than a weapon. It was a mirror, reflecting both the brilliance and blindness of man. Weber exhaled and said softly, "When we built guns, we thought we were shaping the world. But it's these machines that shape what we believe about it." No one answered. The operator turned off the scope and the room fell into darkness. A rare, gentle darkness earned after too much light. Somewhere far away, factories that had once built radar sets were already planning a new era. Civilian air routes, weather forecasts, radio astronomy. The war's end had become the beginning of something even greater. And as the German engineers stepped outside into the rising light of peace, the radar antenna kept turning, slow and endless, drawing invisible circles across the sky. A reminder that the future would belong not to those who conquered, but to those who learned to see. The war had ended, yet its echoes continued in the hum of machines that refused to sleep. In every radar dish, still rotating over airfields from Dover to Okinawa, the same pulse that once tracked bombers now guided ships, measured storms, and scanned the heavens for knowledge rather than conquest. For men like Klaus Weber and Dr. Otto Reinhardt, that realization would outlast the war itself. They returned to a broken Germany not as soldiers, but as witnesses, carriers of a strange, humbling truth. The enemy they had feared turned out to be an idea. That vision, not violence, decides the fate of nations. They had stood before the invisible and seen what arrogance had blinded them to, that the future belonged to those who sought to understand, not those who sought to dominate. In post-war years, many of these same engineers would work side by side with former foes in rebuilding Europe's scientific institutions. Radar research became meteorology, aviation safety, and astronomy. The waves that once guided weapons now traced hurricanes and charted stars. Humanity had turned its instruments of destruction into instruments of insight. Klaus Weber, in one of his last letters before emigrating to the United States, wrote of a sound that never left his dreams: the steady sweep of a radar antenna turning through fog. It is, he wrote, the sound of something greater than victory, the sound of a world learning to see itself. The thought lingers. Perhaps the greatest triumph of the 20th century was not the power to destroy, but the courage to perceive. Some nights, when the sky hums faintly with distant transmissions, it's worth remembering those who first listened. The men who once mistook knowledge for sorcery and found redemption in understanding. Because in every echo of those old machines lies a quiet message that light is never truly lost, it only changes form.